Hi, folks. We are back with another podcast episode. You have met some of our other fellow staff members. I have Mr. Alan Luken here, who is a brand manager with us at Segrest Inc., who has a marine science degree and has a myriad of professional things he does here at Segrest. So, Alan, I'm going to let you roll into tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to your professional job here at Segrest.
Yeah, for me, it started when I was really young. I think with everyone who comes from my generation who got into marine science, marine biology, whatever, we all started by watching Jacques Cousteau, David Attenborough, a lot of these big name guys who anytime you turn the Discovery Channel on, we would watch. And you just can't help but get enamored with everything about the oceans, everything about marine life. So that's where it started for me and got me really into it. And then as I kind of got more into the point where I was starting to look at my profession, what career path I wanted to go down, I really wanted to focus on the pet side of things. So I worked pet retail at an independent pet store in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I'm from, for about 9 years or so. In that process, I went to Coastal Carolina University, got my marine science bachelor's degree, and then came back for a little bit to the pet store just to kind of feel things out. After college, how do we do it? We're young adults. We don't know what we're doing. But then got into, I worked in the public aquarium sector and public zoo sector in Cincinnati and then in Nashville, Tennessee for about a year or so. And then the Segrest Farms opportunity just kind of came about. I had previous experience with Segrest Farms, being at a pet store, of course. So I was very familiar with Segrest. Always admired them as a company on the customer side of things. So I saw a job posting and, I went for it. And I was extremely fortunate. Got the job, got hired, was able to come down here to Tampa. And it's been a bit of a whirlwind ever since I got hired. A lot of people don't know, but I was hired as a salesperson. And if you know me, I couldn't sell a polar bear ice. So I am not a salesperson by any stretch of the imagination. I think everyone here recognized that rather quickly. And then, I kind of shifted around and ultimately ended up working in the marine department. I did special projects and oversaw quality control. And then kind of expanded on, as work through. I spent some time as one of the marine buyers. And now I'm happy to be a brand manager.
So you have a wide variety, and I think, for what I wanted to have you on this episode for is really important to the industry, and I don't think it gets talked about enough, is vendor audits and your perspective of all the different avenues of seeing it from every point of being a hobbyist to a retailer to public aquaria to wholesale buying to purchasing. It really gives you a great perspective and really a well-needed bit of knowledge on our team. So when we talk about vendor audits, give our audience a little background on what that means. What is a vendor audit? Why does Segrest Inc. do it?
So yeah, vendor audits are extremely important, not just for Segrest Inc., but for the industry as a whole. So vendor audits, and specifically what I'm responsible for here, are the marine vendor audits. So all of our suppliers that supply us with live animals from saltwater, we audit on an annual basis, whether it's virtually or whether it's in person. So we do a little bit of both to make sure we can hit everybody every single year and make sure that things are where we need them to be and everybody is following the guidelines that we've put forth.
So if you're unfamiliar with Segrest and how we source our animals, we not only source domestically, but we also source internationally from around 30 different countries around the globe. And that includes, aquaculture and sustainable wild collection. And really it comes down to a mouthful of responsible, ethical, sustainable collection and aquaculture. So what are some of those guidelines and what does that mean to us and the hobbyists?
Yeah, so as Segrest Inc., it's extremely important to us that the animals come first, right? So in every scenario, no matter whether it's an animal that's farmed 2 miles down the road from us here in Tampa, or whether it's an animal that's being shipped on a freight airliner from the other side of the planet, we have standards in place in which must be followed by our suppliers. So in building out these standards, and they're rather complex, but in building out these standards, we source from different organizations and we always take into account different legislation like CITES, like different transport requirements, and of course, local and domestic regulations that we have to follow for animal welfare. So when you put all of those things together, you get the basis of how we build out are requirements for collectors. And that, in essence, is how we start the audit process. We build the foundation first of the things that have to be true. And then on top of that, we can talk about what's built on that applies specifically for what Segrest Inc. stands for.
Absolutely. And I believe that we have some pretty high standards. Elvin set this foundation down over 60 years ago, and it's something that rings true to this day. And I think is even more important in a society that we have such transparency and such importance put upon this. So really, what does that mean for the future of the hobby? As we do these vendor audits, as we're looking at habitats and safe collection, and how do we ensure that we're growing and protecting safe habitats for the hobby for the future?
Right, and that's a key part of any sort of sourcing of any live animal. The one single most important thing that we do is everything about our supply chains, everything about how we source is sustainable. And in this situation, we define sustainable as not impacting the needs of the future. So anything we do today has no negative impact for tomorrow. And that's extremely important because while we're the ones sourcing it for this generation, we hope that everything's around for generations and generations to come. So when we talk to suppliers about whether it's aquaculturing in their own facility here in Florida or somewhere in the United States or overseas, or when we talk to them about collecting wild animals, of course, sustainably, but when we talk about that, one of the keys we always focus on is how does it impact essential fish habitat? Now, if you're not an ecologist or marine biologist or someone who is intimate with those types of terms, what essential fish habitat is habitat in the natural environment, which is essential, needed for these animals to be able to survive, thrive, and reproduce. So no matter what we do, no matter how we collect animals, that habitat and that inhabit that habitat have to remain unimpacted. And that's critical. And that's sustainability in kind of a very vague nutshell, but that's the start of it. That's how you get to the point where you can truly say that these supply chains are sustainable. Now, when you talk about aquaculture and mariculture in particular, it's hard to kind of see how could they possibly impact essential fish habitat or anything similar. There's a myriad of other terms that come into play. Well, you can't just think about someone going out with a net and collecting the animal off of a rocky reef or what have you. It also has to do with the impacts of the supply chain in general. So if you have an aquaculture facility, the things that we're looking at are things like, do you have water runoff from your facility? Are you using natural seawater? If so, how are you getting it? What impacts does your physical facility have on the natural environment around you? And is that negatively impacting the essential fish habitat or any habitats within the region around you? If it is, we have to correct it. That is a hands down, no gray area line for us. And that is something, again, as we talk about, there's a set of standards within Segrest Inc. That's one of the things that goes above and beyond the normal regulations, the normal laws, the normal you have to do this and do this because of the government. That's something that Segrest Inc. stands by. You cannot negatively impact the natural environment in sourcing animals, and it's critical for us.
So we talked a little bit about, protecting the wild habitat as we are collecting animals. There's a lot of pieces that goes into how we collect those animals, and goodness, what those guidelines are. So I know you saw it firsthand. What are some of those things that you've seen, and what are some of the things we have in place that keep those animals coming in healthy and everything safe and sound?
Yeah, so when we talk about sustainable collection, I think everyone has sort of a predisposed notion of what that is, but it's really, there's a lot that goes into it that I don't think gets talked about enough. Or that is understood enough. And that's something that we're working on through Segrest Inc., through our sustainability initiatives, in which we'll be launching here in the very near future for public access and public outreach. But, when you look at sustainable collection, so when we say sustainable collection, what we mean is collecting animals from the wild environments, sustainably, of course. It's why we put sustainable in front of it. That is an absolute requirement. There is no flexibility within that. So when we talk about sustainable collection, there are standards almost all on their own that go into sustainable collection, because that piece is extremely complex. And not complex in the sense of this makes it a really convoluted and jaggedy supply chain. No, 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 no. Complex again in the sense that it's a live animal. You have a human who is collecting this live animal, and you've got to ensure safety. You've got to ensure responsibility. You've got to ensure, above all, sustainability. So when we talk to suppliers about sustainable collection, and for those suppliers who are sustainable collectors for us, we require them to do a lot more than what's legally required, essentially. So there's obviously laws for collecting live animals from wild habitats. Every country has them in some shape or fashion. If you live in the United States, you're very familiar with them. Think about the fishing license that you need just to go fishing. So there's similar laws in every country. Now, every country has different laws, which makes some of our lives a little bit more tedious at times. But again, labor of love, so I won't complain. But so you have the set of laws, and then we look at it from an animal health perspective kind of first, because that's a key cog of sustainability. If what we're doing is damaging in any way to the animal we're collecting, obviously that's absolutely not okay. And then again, when we look at essential fish habitat, the region in which this animal is being collected, if it's damaging to that habitat in any way, shape, or form, it's an absolute no. So there's no gray area there. If there's any sort of damage, that's it. Game over. Not going to work for us. Not a supply line we're going to follow. So we take the steps to ensure that the animal that's collected, the habitat, and the animals within that habitat where it's collected all are safe. And there's no damage, no negative impacts whatsoever. So some of the ways that we do that are requirements on training of divers. So the folks who are actually going out and physically collecting, and you know, this is a good, when you think about the divers in the ocean, you know, if you're a diver, you know this. You know, when I dive, it's otherworldly, and there's an inherent risk with getting in the ocean at any time because of all of the factors, all of the mother nature, essentially. So it's critical that our suppliers and their divers understand that and understand how to be safe. That is extremely important. Animal health is a priority and is the priority. But diver safety, diver health is absolutely critical. Again, this is an area where we have absolutely no gray area. If at any point a supplier's diver is in any sort of danger, where it's direct danger because they are collecting, the manner in which they're collecting, the animals in which they're collecting, whatever it is, that's it. No, that's not a supply chain for Segrest Inc. That is done. There is no debate whatsoever at any given point or any given time. So diver safety, diver education, diver training is critical. And one of the, specifically one of the steps outside of kind of requiring the divers to be aware of the risk and to how to mitigate that risk and how to dive safely, how to collect safely, is actually sponsoring net training programs overseas. So this is, again, another absolute hard stop for us. If, as a supplier, that supplier is not using net collecting techniques, and not just net collecting techniques, because if you don't know, if you're not in like the commercial fishing industry, and I didn't know this until I was well within a fisheries course within college, there's, I don't know, like 30 or 40 different types of nets that are used on a commercial level to collect fish. Now, a lot of that's for the seafood industry, but the same logic can be applied. Gate nets, hoop nets, link nets, it goes on and on and on. I thought it was just like, hey, fish net. It's not. So there's a lot of different techniques and tactics. Some of our suppliers were the kind of pioneers of the net collection, movement. So moons and moons and moons ago, these group of individuals got together and said, we need to focus on how we can improve collection practices. And they did so in a way that could be applied globally. So these folks who started this are still in operation today, and not necessarily as like one organization, it's just multiple people doing it. So they're within multiple organizations, multiple suppliers, in fact. And we were a part of some of that original, Elwin and Quentin, where this was before my time, before I was born. But so these people have developed, because they are collectors, they've developed these net training protocols and procedures. And it's to say that it's a science is kind of an understatement. The pride that they have in it is incredible. It is next level type stuff. It's, when you talk about the best of the best of the best, it's these folks. They do things right. They do things ethically. They do things sustainably. And they apply that to net trainings. And what they do, if you're not familiar with net trainings, which you can see some of these on social media, in fact, especially on Facebook. But what they do is take a select group of divers who work for this supplier, and they go out with these experts who have been doing it for sometimes decades, since the late 80s. And they take these divers through an extremely rigorous course. In fact, I've participated in one of them sort of virtually because, again, COVID. But I know a ton of people have gone through them. Obviously, our suppliers and the divers who work for our suppliers, but also a good colleague and good friend of mine has actually gone through just to see what it's like, gone through one of these courses. And it's, if you're a certified scuba diver, think about that on steroids, times like 45 million, because it's so incredibly intense, but for the right reason. You have, as a collector, as a sustainable collector for the aquarium industry, you have a moral and ethical responsibility to that animal and to that habitat. So you have to be, you can't just be good. It's like professional athletes, and it's a perfect equation for these guys, because a lot of us can probably use a net and scoop a fish out. Like, I'm pretty good at it. When we get into the zebra danios and stuff, I forget about it. I can't catch them.
So you touched a lot on sustainable wild collection, and we have the same guidelines and the same standards that we need to have for our aquaculture facilities here, our partners that we purchase from globally, as well as mariculture. And I think all three play a large role in making us who we are and the future of the hobby. So talk to us a little bit about how those three have to be part of the industry in order to make it work.
Yeah, absolutely. So the standards that we have and the way we conduct our audits, again, apply to all of our supply lines, whether that's aquaculture, whether it's mariculture, whether it's sustainable collection. So we do that for one very specific reason, and that reason is all three of those source lines, especially for marine, are extremely important for the future of the trade. The benefits for the trade from aquaculture, mariculture, and sustainable collection are critical for the future of the pet trade, especially the marine animal trade. So the way that it works for us, at least, is we look at each as what are the benefits from each individual source, essentially, each individual supply line, and how can we capitalize that on the most. So when we look at aquaculture, for example, you look at the husbandry and the technology and all the advancements that come with breeding a new fish, raising it from a larval stage up. You gain so much insight in that. You take that information, you can apply it to mariculture, you can apply it to sustainable collection, because all of those steps at some point or another involve husbandry, involve taking care of that animal. Same with mariculture. You look at the benefits of mariculture, and we could spend an entire podcast just on that. But you look at how are corals being grown, what is the most successful way of growing these corals, and then there's implications, of course, for coral restoration, which is one of the coolest things in the world, that the pet trade drives some of the innovation for reef restoration globally, which is mind-boggling to me, but is really neat. And then with sustainable collection, how can we go about our business sustainably? How can we have the variety that the trade needs? How can we protect the natural environment, which sustainable collection does, and we can touch on that. But how can we protect the natural environment? And how can we get the animals to the people that need them in a safe, responsible manner?
Definitely. And for those of you that don't know, we do vendor audits virtually, especially this year. And some of these are in a little bit more of a remote area. So safe travels and such things like that. So we also do go visit them. Alan, I know you said you do the marine branch side of things. So tell us a little bit about when you get over there and you visit some really fantastically unique places. I'm sure you have plenty of great stories as a fish enthusiast to tell. But tell us a little bit about when you get there, you're focused on, the health of the animals, the processes, the laws that we have to watch not only in that country, but the laws that we have to adhere to. So walk us through some of those steps.
Yeah, so as we do these audits, and yes, we do a lot of them virtually, and this year we're doing all of them virtually, but we typically will do them annually. We'll do in-person ones every single year. So the most recent one we did in Bali and Jakarta in Indonesia. So to kind of set the mind frame of how these work when we're physically over in person, and the same logic applies for virtual, but quite frankly, the setting is way cooler in Indonesia than it is sitting behind my desk at 3 a.m. because of the time differences. But regardless, so the way that these work, and again, we'll use Indonesia because it was the most recent one as the example. Weeks prior, as we build up to the audit process, there is an in-depth study of all of the laws and regulations for that particular source country, how they apply to international laws, regulations, and treaties like CITES, and are there any updates that we need to adhere to from the previous audit from the previous year. So that takes a significant effort right off the gate. And what we do in the process of working through that, we are obviously in contact with our suppliers, but in the build up to all of these audits, every single year, at the beginning of every single year, we distribute what we call our Marine Supplier Statement of Commitment. And what that is a document that we have come up with here at Segrest Inc. And it's been adapted over the years, and it changes as laws and regulations and as frankly as our policies, as we learn and get better, it adapts. And every single year, every single one of our marine suppliers has to sign and agree to everything within that statement of commitment and adhere to it for all 365 days of that period. And it's critical that every single supplier does, because that statement of commitment outlines everything that we require of a supplier: how they collect, how they transport, how they take care of animals, everything. So as we've got that, as they're reading through that, and it's a rather substantial document, so which is penned by a lot of us here at Segrest Inc. But as they're reading through that, we're doing our back-end research on any potential legislative updates. And then once we're there, it's really quite an experience, as you can imagine. But from the standpoint of, we see the end product here where we are in the United States, but if you're watching from another country, as importers, as hobbyists, we see the end product. When you're over with these collectors and quite literally side by side as they're collecting fishes, it's a little bit different. It puts a different spin on things, and you have to put yourself in a different mindset. The country's different, the laws and regulations are different, the culture is different. But at the end of the day, this is why we have these standards, because these standards are universal, apply to everyone. Sustainability doesn't change country by country, at least not for us. We follow a very strict guideline on sustainability, on what it means to be a supplier, how to be responsible and ethical and sustainable. So as we're over there, we're going through these documents with the suppliers. I can tell you, for example, and I won't go on too many of these anecdotes, but for example, in Jakarta last year, you can ask if you ever talked to this particular supplier. We spent the better part of 48 hours, I would say, locked in essentially an office building, it was actually pretty wild. It was like the second floor of a fish house. So the view here, I don't have much of a view. There, we were looking down over this massive fish house. It was wild. But so we were locked in that office room for about 48 hours. And if you remember, this is right around the time when the Indonesian coral export ban update was coming out. So we're reviewing documents that are being proposed to the Indonesian government. Here's what the collectors are wanting, and we get some influence on that. So we get to say, okay, this makes sense for what we require. This makes sense for sustainability. This works for us. And there were times when we looked at it and said, I don't know about that. Explain to me how that will apply to what we require. And there was good discussion. It was back and forth discussion about how we can move this entire trade forward and be more sustainable. So you do a lot of that. You do a lot of office type setting work. There's a lot of travel. The fish houses sometimes are in very remote parts of the country. So I spent 8 hours in the car, which I didn't think you could in some of these small island countries, but you can apparently. So I spent 8 hours in the car driving from one side of Bali to the other. But it's all worth it, no doubt about it. And outside of the type of legislative and office and on paper type work, uh, we do everything with them. They go about their business. They've got a business to run. They've got a supply house to run. They've got vendors to fulfill, and we kind of just observe and we make comments and we work with them if we see opportunity for improvement. And they help us too. When we're over there, one of the cool things is we can see how our fish are packed on site. So again, I'm sorry for going on another anecdote. I could talk about this for hours. So for example, again, in Indonesia, this was in the Philippines. So this was the year prior. We're in just outside of Manila in the Philippines. And sure enough, I show up at the facility in the morning of, and they go, "We just got your order." And at the time, I was still doing a lot with the buying. I was like, "Really? Okay, well, that's cool. So how come? Like, what do we do now?" So it was a pretty wild experience to see how the process goes from the animals are at the fish house now, right? So let me take a step back. The way that our supply chains and the way that a lot of marine supply chains work when it's sustainable collection, especially in overseas in the Indo-Pacific, in Australia, same manner here, is there are one of two things. Is either a collection station that is physically right on the water. It's where the boats or whatever it is that they use to get out. Sometimes they can just walk off the beach because they live in those areas, and I'm so jealous. But there's a physical fish house where some of them actually have we would call live aboard boats, not sailboats, but you get the idea, where they actually take a boat out from somewhere and can spend multiple days on the water collecting animals. They have the boats they're wild actually. They're kind of rigged with equipment to take care of all these animals while they're out there on the ocean, which is crazy to me. But those are really the two options, right, for how you're collecting sustainable collected animals. And then you have to take the animals from these collection facilities, which are owned by a supplier, and back to that supplier's fish house. And what the fish house is say you're in the Philippines, right? Your fish house could be in Manila, which is the capital country, very metropolitan, has the big airport, international. So it makes sense, right? Logistics to get it to export. You may have collection stations in Batangas and Cebu and all over the place that are nowhere near Manila. You have to get the animals from those collection stations to where you are in Manila. So that's part of the supply chain. And that's part of what we talk to them about. And that's part that we get to see, right? So not only is it how are the animals collected, but then you're transporting from where they were collected to where ultimately they're going to be held for export. And now they're owned by the same company. So it's an easy transit. It's not anything that's terribly complicated, but there's steps that need to be taken. You've got to be able to pack the fish. You've got to be able to put the fish in a vehicle that is going to sustain them. These countries are tropical countries, so they're warm. How do you get the animals from A to B? Sometimes it can be on a ferry. Sometimes it could be in a big, we call them reefer trucks, but they're like the air conditioned controlled vehicles. So then they get to the fish house. In the fish house, that's really where the magic happens. And that's kind of where we'll pick back up on this story, right? So we just get this order in. That's just so happens to be the Segrest Farms order. And we're talking through, okay, well, here's how we typically pack. And by we, I mean the fish supplier, right? So I'm kind of letting them do what they normally do and doing everything within my power, not to just start geeking out and go, okay, I know we ordered this, but I really want this, because the amount of fish that they have, just the variety is incredible, but there's a limited amount of space, and I knew that, and I screwed up at the very end, but we'll get there. So you get to see the processes that go into play, and these exporters and these collectors take health and quality, especially, extremely seriously. You kind of have an image in your head when you think about where your fish come from. I can tell you it's probably wrong. They take it so seriously that the standards that they have in place, we've actually learned from, and we can apply in different scenarios here in the United States. And some of the learnings we've taken from some of these collectors, because they're really the boots on the ground's experts, are now being applied to your local fish store. There's things that we've learned from fish collectors that are applied to your local fish store. If you don't think that's neat, then I don't know what to tell you, because that's crazy to me. So the steps that go into that are mind-boggling, and then as they pack the order, they've got a lot to think about, because if you think here in the United States, we may send something, from one state to 3 states over. They have a gigantic ocean that they have to traverse to get it to us. So there's, again, more standards that come into play. How do we get things healthily and maintain the quality? And they do an amazing job. And all of our suppliers do an amazing job, really, of making sure, that they maintain that quality throughout the supply chain. So it's a wild experience to see. That's one we could probably talk about for 3 or 4 days. And if you ever see me somewhere and you want to talk about fish houses and travels abroad to marine suppliers, I'm happy to, especially if we get like a chicken tender platter, we can talk about it all day long. But so it's crazy. But to finish that story, so at the very end, we had about 1.5 boxes left over of space. And outside of, if you know me, you know what my favorite fish is. But outside of my favorite fish, one of my favorite fish is the sunburst anthias, or you might call them a fathead anthias. And they had just had just cleared. So the fish, once they're collected, go into this temporary holding where it's how's the fish look now that it's here at our facility? Let it settle in, let it kind of make sure the quality is up to par, and so on and so forth. And then it kind of gets transitioned to these are ready for export. So these had just got shifted to that ready for export that morning. And so we're like, yeah, we got 1.5 boxes left. I was like, how many of those anthias can we fit in the box? And so sure enough, they did. And that was actually my last day there. And I flew back, not on the same plane as the fish. That would have been cool. But not on the same plane. But I got back to Segrest about 12 hours after those fish came in. And I remember the buyer at the time, the main buyer at the time, didn't ask me how my trip was. Just looks at me and goes, "Do you know anything about these anthias? I don't like them." No. Anthias? Oh yeah, I may have handpicked those and added those, and I may be buying one for my tank at home. But don't worry about it. No, it's dangerous when you go over there, is what I'm getting at. But yeah, it's crazy to see the whole supply chain in action. It really, really is.
Now, I'm glad you bring that up. It brings a very human aspect to, I think, that some of the hobbyists just don't really get to see or think about. They think about where the fish come from, but like you said, it's a very different picture when you actually get to experience it. And it's why I want to bring you on here to share that. I'm glad you brought up that these places there. When we go over there, you said they had a banner and our logo on it, and they're so excited to see us, and that really just tells the story of how we're partners with these people and how we share information as far as how can we have better husbandry standards, what are best practices. And we work for these vendors for years. Some of these vendors have been with us since almost the inception of our marine carrying at Segrest. So how has that partnership really just kind of benefited us, and really that plays down to the retailer and really to you guys, the hobbyists?
Yeah, and that's exactly how we look at it, right? We don't look at it necessarily as a supplier-buyer relationship, because that's very black and white, very cut and dry, very bland. And frankly, is not something that is going to change the future of the trade, much less change it for the better. So the strategy that we take, especially with marine suppliers, and I would say all suppliers, but again, marine is kind of where my wheelhouse is. So when we talk with our marine suppliers, we don't talk to them just as, hey, can you send me this fish because we need it? We have genuine conversations on a pretty consistent basis about how are things going? What can we do better? How can we be better partners? How can we improve X, Y, and Z? And how can we continue to move forward? So it's critical for us, at least, that throughout the supply chain, because while the supply chain is simple in the sense that you have very short, quick supply chains, there's a complexity to transporting live animals, whether it's from my house in Tampa to somebody else's house in Orlando, or shipping it across the entire globe. It's a live animal, and you have extra care that goes into it than, say, shipping a box of shoes or what have you. So yeah, there's a mentality that we build and a relationship that we build with all of our suppliers that is beyond just a buyer relationship. To give you an example, so I do the marine audits, right? And I work with all the standards. I'm not a buyer. We have three other employees just at Segrest Farms, and then we've got, oh geez, at least three more within Segrest Inc. that are the buyers. So we've got multiple people talking to them from multiple different aspects, and then there's another one of our executives helps a lot with this, in the sense that he talks to some of our suppliers. Sometimes it seems like on a daily basis, but it's all for how can we be better partners, how can we continue moving forward. It's critical for us, absolutely critical.
Definitely. And I think that's a great point. When we do have challenges and when we do foresee things that, are coming down the pike, we can address that. It's a very kind of, open conversation when you have a relationship like that with our vendors.
Yeah, absolutely. It's you know when I was at in pet retail, so when I was at the retail store, and this isn't true of Segrest Farms, but there were suppliers where we would never hear from them. We'd place an order, and the order would show up. That's not that's not how things should be handled with live animals at any point in the supply chain, and that's why we think it's so critical in working with these suppliers. And while I work with truly with the supply to Segrest Inc. and even the Segrest Inc. to retail end, it's the same mentality. We don't consider our folks salespeople. I think we call them partner coordinators and things like that. So it's more than just selling a live animal. It's partnering with someone to make sure that the live animal gets to where it needs to go in a healthy manner, in a responsible manner, in an ethical manner. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, the whole reason we do everything that we do every day of the week is to make sure that the hobbyist, the end consumer for these animals, can enjoy the animal for as long as possible. And it's critical that all starts with the supply chain. Anyone who audits us looks over, and by audits us, I mean, our customers come visit Segrest Inc. facilities, and to see these documents, they might see a turn of phrase or verbiage in there. They're like, didn't we talk about that? We did. We absolutely did. You are an expert in that field, and we applied it here with what we do, and we very much so appreciate it. So, while Segrest Inc. has, I'm a little bit biased here, but while Segrest Inc. has some of the best minds within the trade, we're constantly learning. We're constantly trying to get better. So we learn all the time from our retailers, from hobbyists even. I mean, there's hobbyists who have asked me questions that have made me think, should we really do it this way, or should we, rethink how we do it? And so, when it comes to supply chains, no matter who you are within the trade, you could be a hobbyist, there could be your only fish tank, you could have a nano cube on your tank. Ask questions about supply chain. Ask questions, learn about it. If you're at your retailer, ask them questions. Reach out to us if you have questions, because we have answers. But at the same time, we're going to ask you questions. How'd the fish look? How is this fish doing? How did this fish do compared to this fish? Do you think this quality is good? All kinds of things. And that's how we get better. That's how, as a trade, we get better.
Absolutely. And we're constantly updating. So we've talked a lot about on the vendor side of things and what we have to do here. On the flip side, when you get back home and you put your feet back on the ground here at Segrest, there's a lot of things on our side that have to be in place in order for the fish to ensure their health and ensure their documents and CITES and legal. How does that work once the fish are here? And I know there's a lot of back end stuff previous to the fish landing. What do we have to have on our end in order to make it safe transport for the hobbyists and safe for all the animals?
Right. So much in the same way that we have collection standards and statements of commitments for our suppliers annually, the Segrest Inc. facilities sign a very similar document. Now it's adapted to being a importer / wholesaler, so the verbiage is a little bit different. It doesn't say collecting necessarily, because we don't collect fish, but we have other steps that aren't necessarily in the supplier form. So we have a document, and it's the same way. This year, because we changed it a bit, because of some initiatives we're taking on, and because of some changes in legislation, when we look at things like Indonesia, we look at things like Hawaii, different pressures globally, things like that, and the growing movement of environmentalism, and how do we respond as a trade. We had to make some changes this year, which is, again, always looking to get better. We spent at least 5 weeks. It might have been more than that. I'll be honest, I'm losing track of time. It might have been about 5 weeks of research, of development of policies, of, in a sense, simulating these policies and how are they going to work. We take extreme care in how we word things, because we understand the ramifications if we leave things ambiguous. So yeah, I think we changed like 2 paragraphs this year within this document. And yeah, I think I spent about 5 weeks on it. So yeah, a lot goes into it. And yeah, so on our side, what this document holds and these standards to which we hold ourselves. And again, if you're a retailer and would like to see it, reach out to us, and we'd be happy to oblige. So what this document does is holds ourselves, essentially, polices ourselves to a standard that we think the industry needs to be held to. So we look at things like, how do we work with suppliers? That's in here. That's one of the, I think it might actually be clause 1A, which is the first clause. How are suppliers communicated with? How do we select suppliers? I mean, that's a whole process in and of itself. So how do we go through that process? How do we properly vet new suppliers, especially ones on the other side of the world? What does that look like? How do we make sure that we adhere to international laws and treaties and legislation, whether that's CITES ensuring permits are up to date, whether that's the laws and regulations of transport. So before I came to Segrest, I had no clue that there is a set of laws that is designed specifically at how to transport live animals. And within that, specific laws about transporting live fish that get down to the nitty gritty of boxes, amount of water. It's nuts. So you got to dive into all of that. And that's represented in this document. And then, we get to the point where we look at how are the animals cared for throughout the supply chain. While we hold our suppliers to that standard, as they collect or as they're growing out or what have you, to the point of export. And then once obviously they're within a Segrest Inc facility, our suppliers are then just communicated with, and then the onus is on us. How do we ensure quality animals? How do we ensure that the animal is going to make it to the retailer safely? And then in turn, we want to support our retailers. We want to partner with our retailers. How do we get them to have the absolute most probability for success on these animals? So husbandry and quality control and quality assurance are key parts of this document. And then, it kind of all culminates into how does this audit and review process work? And that is something that I did not start this. I would love to say that I did, but Elwin Segrest and Quentin Segrest before me put a lot of legwork into what does it take to get to this point. And we've refined it since. We refine it every year. But the work that they did, the groundwork that they did, the knowledge and insights that they gained through decades of experience within the marine trade and pet trade in general, really laid the foundation for this. And now we have such a strong foundation in these documents and in these practices that we're able to go above and beyond what we ever thought was going to be possible. And we're able to use this and share this knowledge and share this information to help try to make the entire pet trade better. That's what we're here for. Segrest Inc is great, and we want to do everything we can to be the best option for stores, for hobbyists, for suppliers. But ultimately, at the end of the day, we know that our actions have ramifications and impacts throughout the trade. And that's how these documents are written. That's how our practices and audits and supplier visits are maintained and withheld. So it's critical for us. We view this with the utmost importance. We look at this as we've got to get this right. There is no option for failure. It sounds cliche, but it's the truth. These are live animals. This is a supply chain management. This is an industry management type effort. So It's intense, but we do it because we love it, for one, and because it's the right, responsible, ethical, and sustainable thing to do.
It sounds like you have a busy week coming up. I know you said you have your first audit starting Monday, or is it Sunday
It'll
evening because
be,
of the
yeah,
time?
the first one is going to be, I think, Monday night. I better go check my calendar. But yeah, so they start. We've spent again the 5 weeks process of getting these documents signed, and edited, and then out and signed, and now over the past couple of weeks we've started to contact our suppliers to set up times. So the process itself virtually takes a couple of different sessions of a few hours each. In person, it's a couple of days. But in that a couple of days, we go out to lunch. There's transit time, so yeah, exactly. So it's virtually it's much more succinct, so we're able to do it a little bit more efficiently. But it's still the same premise. I know there's some suppliers that don't like that we do it because everybody's Wi-Fi is different. But we actually make them, if they're a tablet or a cell phone, make them carry us around like we're walking through the facility, and ensure that we can see everything. So it's more than just asking questions, even virtually. There's a psychology to all of it. There's a method to all this madness. We test it on each other prior to working with our suppliers. We ask our suppliers what more we could have done, how we could improve that whole process, how we could get better information. So yeah, it's they start next week. We have a lot of suppliers to go through. It's frankly terrifying to my sleep schedule thinking about how many we have. But yeah, so it'll be fun. So if you need me for like the next month, call me at night because that's when I'm going to be awake.
Well, fantastic. I really appreciate you coming on here. I think that gives, our retailers, our hobby partners, just a great perspective on something, they may not ever really get to talk about or get to really think truly through. So I appreciate you coming on here. I appreciate you being a part of, the Segrest Inc. and helping us be who we are. And, in the words of our leadership, this is what help looks like. This is who we are. I know you've heard that plenty of times. All right, Alan, well, I'll let you get back to it. You have a great evening. And
All right, thank you.